What if the most infamous man in history had never existed at all? No speeches, no swastikas, no Führer rising from the chaos of post-World War I Germany. Just pause for a second and really imagine that timeline. Germany still loses the Great War. The economy still collapses. Millions are still angry, hungry, and humiliated. But Adolf Hitler is never born. No single man to unite resentment into obsession. No voice to turn fear into mass loyalty. In this rewritten age, history does not suddenly become peaceful or moral, but it becomes uncertain in a completely different way. This story explores how Germany might have evolved without a central extremist figure, how Europe would react without a Nazi threat, why World War II as we know it may never happen, and how the modern world could look radically different because of one missing life. There is no fantasy here, no perfect utopia, only realism pushed to its logical extreme. Because removing one man does not remove human ambition, hatred, or power hunger. It only changes how they express themselves. Across 5 parts, this video rewrites the 20th century step by step, from the ruins of 1918 to the world we live in today, and finally asks a dangerous question about the future itself. Lean back and experience history rewritten. Germany in 1918 was already a nation on the brink of chaos, scarred by defeat in World War I, burdened by the Treaty of Versailles, and suffocating under crushing reparations. Soldiers returned home to find cities in turmoil, hyperinflation destroying savings, and a society fractured by hunger, poverty, and despair. Political factions proliferated, ranging from communist revolutionaries to nationalist militias, all vying for influence in the vacuum left by a crumbling monarchy. Yet, without Hitler to provide a singular rallying point, extremist nationalist movements struggled to consolidate power. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or any comparable radical group, remained small and largely ineffective, lacking the charisma and oratory that would have otherwise drawn desperate citizens into mass movements. Street fights between competing factions continued, but these skirmishes were fragmented, uncoordinated, and ultimately unable to dominate the political landscape. In this timeline, Germany's political instability persisted, but the absence of a dominant dictator meant that no single ideology could monopolize the public imagination. The Weimar Republic, weak and constantly challenged, still survived in a precarious balance, occasionally supported by moderate factions who understood the danger of total collapse, and by a population too exhausted by war to embrace extremism wholesale. Economically, the German crisis unfolded in a familiar yet altered manner. Hyperinflation still tore through the middle class during the early 1920s, wiping out pensions, savings, and trust in government institutions. However, without Hitler's exploitation of nationalist resentment, extremist parties advocating for radical economic reforms gained less traction. Instead, smaller socialist and communist groups managed to win influence in local governments and labor unions, often proposing piecemeal solutions that aimed to stabilize prices, protect workers, and rebuild infrastructure incrementally. International loans, such as the Dawes Plan, were still accepted, though with more debate and scrutiny from a population less susceptible to charismatic demagoguery. Germany's recovery was slower and more chaotic than in reality, but it was not entirely derailed. Moderate political leaders, though ineffectual in many ways, managed to implement cautious reforms that prevented total economic collapse. Industrialists and business elites, Deprived of a powerful nationalist figure, promising revival through militarism remained focused on production and trade, which inadvertently preserved some level of economic continuity and kept a semblance of normalcy alive amid social unrest. Culturally, the absence of Hitler allowed the artistic and intellectual movements of the Weimar era to flourish in an altered form. Berlin and Munich became experimental hubs for expressionism, early cinema, literature, and philosophical debate. Without Nazi censorship, many avant-garde artists and writers avoided persecution, leading to a slightly more vibrant and diverse cultural landscape. Universities and scientific communities retained more autonomy, allowing theoretical physics, engineering, and social sciences to progress without the ideological interference that would later suppress academic freedom. At the same time, political violence still existed, as paramilitary groups clashed over territory and influence, and assassinations of moderate politicians occurred sporadically. Nevertheless, the absence of a unifying fascist figure prevented the systematic purging of dissenting voices, giving society a fragile but real platform for debate, experimentation, and the preservation of cultural memory. Intellectuals, writers, and scientists navigated a tense political atmosphere, but did not face the existential threat that would have otherwise forced exile or silence, making the Weimar cultural explosion less tragically short-lived, though still haunted by uncertainty. Internationally, Germany's position in Europe shifted subtly but significantly. The Allies enforced the Treaty of Versailles with continued scrutiny, but without the rise of a charismatic fascist leader exploiting nationalist resentment, diplomatic relations evolved differently. France and Britain still monitored German rearmament and political movements, but they faced less urgent pressure to respond to aggressive expansionism. The Soviet Union observed cautiously, still seeking influence in communist circles and leftist uprisings, yet lacking the clear pretext for confrontation that Hitler's Germany would have provided. Smaller nationalist factions within Germany attempted to assert themselves in regional politics, occasionally provoking local crises. But these incidents were fragmented, giving European powers time to negotiate rather than confront a unified threat. This fragmented political environment meant that Germany remained unstable and unpredictable, but less threatening as a military power, creating a tense but avoidable balance in continental politics. The world watched, uncertain whether Germany would stumble toward revolution, moderation, or some unexpected synthesis, but it had not yet become a flashpoint for a global conflict. By the early 1930s, Germany remained a powder keg of social, economic, and political pressures. Mass unemployment, continuing inflation, and the legacy of a humiliating war fueled discontent. But no figure emerged with a singular vision and manipulative skill to convert chaos into totalitarian control. Regional strongmen, military councils, and political coalitions jockeyed for influence, often counteracting each other rather than consolidating power. Citizens lived with a mixture of hope, fear, and pragmatism, sometimes supporting local reforms and social programs, other times joining radical fringe groups that ultimately lacked cohesion or national influence. The absence of Hitler fundamentally altered the trajectory of the nation, preventing the rise of the Nazi regime, the orchestration of mass atrocities, and the rapid path to global war that history would otherwise follow. Yet, instability remained a constant threat, a reminder that structural pressures alone could still destabilize a society. Germany in this timeline was quieter but far from peaceful, setting the stage for a dramatically different Europe in the years to come. With Hitler never rising to power, Germany's political instability persisted, but the radical nationalist surge that would have led to the Nazi regime never materialized. European powers observed cautiously, expecting that Germany might stabilize or collapse under its internal pressures, yet no aggressive ideology demanded immediate confrontation. Without the charismatic Nazi leadership, extremist paramilitary factions remained fragmented, their rhetoric loud but disorganized. Austria remained independent, and the Anschluss never occurred, leaving a patchwork of states in Central Europe intact. Political extremism in neighboring countries from France to Italy continued to grow, but none achieved the scale or international attention necessary to trigger a continental crisis. The League of Nations, though largely ineffective, found slightly more room to maneuver, mediating minor disputes without facing the overwhelming threat of fascist expansionism. Diplomats worked cautiously, aware that unresolved post-war tensions still simmered, yet the absence of a dominant German threat allowed for a tenuous but existent peace. Citizens in European capitals lived under subtle unease, aware of the potential for regional conflict, but not yet facing the global storm that would define the next decade in our original timeline. In the absence of Nazi Germany, the balance of power shifted, subtly but profoundly. France and Britain, unburdened by the imminent threat of Hitler's ambitions, pursued slower, more calculated foreign policies. Military budgets were moderated. Intelligence operations focused on the Soviet Union, and alliances were re-evaluated with caution rather than desperation. Italy under Mussolini still pursued its imperial ambitions, but without a German partner, ambitions in Austria and the Balkans faced greater obstacles. Eastern Europe remained a patchwork of fragile democracies and monarchies, each balancing nationalist ambitions against the threat of communist influence. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, observed Germany's lack of cohesion as an opportunity. Stalin sought to expand influence in neighboring regions, supporting local communist movements and exploiting weaker governments. Europe was stable on the surface, but simmered with tension, a continent waiting for the next spark, which could come from ideology, territorial ambition, or economic collapse, rather than from a single dominant figure manipulating the masses. Economically, the 1930s were turbulent, but slightly less catastrophic than in the real timeline. Germany, lacking a strong nationalist dictator to unify industrial and military ambitions, experienced slower recovery and uneven growth. Trade networks fluctuated with political uncertainty, yet moderate parties in government managed incremental stabilization programs, often supported by international loans and cautious economic planning. Unemployment remained high, particularly among veterans and urban workers, fueling local protests, but failing to catalyze mass movements. Other European countries, observing Germany's precarious recovery, implemented their own cautious economic reforms, aware that instability could spill across borders. Global markets responded slowly, with investors hesitant yet relieved that Germany's radicalization did not threaten international trade or military escalation. This cautious balance prevented dramatic hyperinflation crises in neighboring states and allowed smaller economies to adapt gradually, creating a complex web of dependency and tentative cooperation across the continent. Social and cultural life in Europe evolved in a strange liminal state. Without Nazi censorship and propaganda shaping German society, intellectual and artistic communities continued to flourish in relative freedom. Cities like Berlin, Vienna, and Prague remained hubs of innovation, music, literature, and cinema. Universities preserved autonomy, and scientific communities pursued research without ideological interference, accelerating certain developments in physics, engineering, and medicine. However, social tension remained high. Political violence persisted sporadically, with assassinations, street clashes, and extremist agitation common in urban centers. Citizens navigated daily life amid uncertainty, balancing hope for moderation against fear of unpredictable radicalism. Cultural expression, though freer than in the original timeline, still bore traces of the deep economic and political stress weighing on society, producing a unique blend of creative experimentation and anxious caution. By the late 1930s, Europe existed in a fragile equilibrium. Germany had stabilized enough to avoid immediate collapse, but the internal divisions and economic pressures ensured that it was far from strong. France, Britain, and smaller European nations continued cautious diplomacy, aware of the potential for conflict, but relieved that the continent had avoided the sudden rise of a unified fascist threat. The Soviet Union steadily increased influence in Eastern Europe, preparing for regional opportunism. Italy's imperial ambitions faced more obstacles without Germany as a partner, while smaller nationalist factions in Hungary, Poland, and the Balkans navigated complex alliances to preserve autonomy. Europe was quieter than in our real timeline, but tense, with power distributed unevenly and danger lurking in every corner. The absence of Hitler created a continent where war was possible, but not inevitable, where diplomacy had a fighting chance, and where the stage was set for a world that could have evolved along a completely different trajectory in the coming decades. With Hitler absent from history, the world entered the late 1930s in a tense but remarkably different state. Germany remained politically fragmented, its internal conflicts preventing any aggressive continental expansion. Austria remained independent. The Sudeten crisis never ignited, and the political vacuum created by Hitler's absence left no centralized fascist ideology to mobilize millions. Consequently, the sparks that would have ignited a global conflict in our timeline were delayed, diffused, or rerouted. However, regional conflicts still arose due to competing nationalist ambitions, economic pressure, and ideological clashes. Japan, pursuing imperial ambitions in Asia, expanded into China without the distraction of a European war pulling Western attention. The Soviet Union, emboldened by a weaker Germany and a fragmented Europe, sought to increase influence over Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Meanwhile, France and Britain maintained cautious military preparedness, not fully trusting Germany's stability, but relieved to face no immediate unified threat. The stage for a world war existed, but its shape, scale, and timeline were fundamentally altered, creating a planet where global conflict was possible but not inevitable. In this rewritten 1940s scenario, the United States remained largely isolationist, engaging with Europe primarily through economic channels and diplomacy rather than military intervention. Without the provocation of Hitler's invasions and the aggressive expansion of Nazi Germany, American public opinion leaned toward non-involvement, limiting the country's role on the world stage. Technological development, particularly in weaponry and aviation, progressed slower than in our timeline, as the pressure of a global war accelerated innovation in reality. Nuclear research, which in our timeline was catalyzed by fears of German progress, advanced cautiously and without urgency. Meanwhile, European powers focused on internal stability, border security, and the containment of Soviet influence. This alternate world saw numerous localized conflicts, coups and territorial disputes, but the unprecedented scale of destruction associated with World War II did not materialize. Civilian populations in cities such as London, Paris, and Warsaw experienced less devastation, while industrial centers remained mostly intact, preserving infrastructure and economic potential for post-war reconstruction. Humanitarian outcomes diverged dramatically in this timeline. The absence of a centralized Nazi regime meant that the systematic genocide of Jewish communities, Romani populations, disabled individuals, and other targeted groups never occurred in the industrialized, state-sponsored form we know. Anti-Semitism and other prejudices persisted, but atrocities were scattered, often limited to localized violence rather than orchestrated extermination programs. Refugee movements still happened due to regional conflicts or political purges, but the global scale of human suffering was markedly reduced. Conversely, the Soviet Union's expansionist policies created zones of oppression in Eastern Europe, including purges, deportations, and forced labor, but these atrocities were geographically limited and lacked the industrialized efficiency of the Holocaust. Civilians experienced a world still shaped by fear and uncertainty, but without the singular terror imposed by a regime that had dominated Europe with ideology, terror, and military might. Humanity faced danger in multiple directions, rather than a single, all-consuming source of destruction. Geopolitically, the absence of Hitler redefined alliances and rivalries. France and Britain remained wary of both Germany and the Soviet Union, maintaining defensive postures while negotiating with smaller neighboring states to prevent expansionist crises. Italy continued to pursue imperial goals in Africa, but without German coordination, limiting its reach and making campaigns more sporadic and vulnerable. Eastern Europe became a chessboard of influence, with local monarchs, military leaders, and political factions maneuvering for power under the watchful eyes of France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The Mediterranean and Asian theaters developed independently, resulting in localized wars rather than a single unified global conflict. Trade routes, colonial holdings, and international finance were disrupted at times, but never fully paralyzed, allowing some economic continuity despite persistent uncertainty. This multipolar tension created a world defined by negotiation, espionage, and brinkmanship, where war could erupt at any point but required careful conditions rather than spontaneously spreading across continents. By 1945, this alternate timeline had produced a planet with scars, tension, and uncertainty, but no total war. Nations rebuilt cautiously, prepared for instability, yet spared the massive destruction that defined our historical World War II. Technology developed slower in some sectors, accelerated in others through smaller-scale conflicts, but humanity retained more industrial and intellectual infrastructure. Socially and politically, Europe remained fractured, with governments experimenting with reforms to stabilize societies in the absence of dictatorial control. Populations survived with less trauma but lived in a world of fragmented threats where regional wars and ideological struggles continued to shape daily life. The absence of Hitler did not eliminate human ambition, greed, or cruelty. It only redistributed them across multiple actors and contexts. By avoiding the global conflagration of our timeline, the world entered a cautious, tense, and uncertain post-war era, ready to face the unknown challenges of a mid-20th century rewritten by the absence of one man's ambition. The post-war world without Hitler and the Nazi regime evolved along a drastically different path, reshaping global politics, economics, and culture. Europe emerged from the 1940s with its cities largely intact, its population less traumatized, and its infrastructure preserved. Germany, still recovering from internal instability but spared the devastation of total war, maintained regional influence without dominating the continent. France and Britain retained global colonial interests longer, adjusting slowly to emerging independence movements. The Soviet Union's expansion in Eastern Europe, unopposed by a strong Germany, created a significant but contained sphere of influence. The United States, having remained largely isolationist during the 1940s, assumed a slower but deliberate rise to global prominence. The absence of a clear global antagonist changed the geopolitical balance. Alliances were less rigid, military escalation more cautious, and diplomacy carried a heavier weight in preventing localized conflicts from igniting larger wars. This cautious, fragmented world created the foundation for a modern era defined by negotiation, regional tensions, and incremental technological progress, rather than rapid war-driven innovation. Technological development in this alternate modern world advanced unevenly. Without the immediate pressure of global war, military innovation progressed at a measured pace. Jet engines, nuclear research, and radar systems developed more slowly, while other fields such as computer science and medicine benefited from uninterrupted research. The Internet, originally accelerated by Cold War military needs, emerged later, delaying global connectivity by decades. Space exploration progressed at a similar, slower pace, with international competition less intense and more collaborative in nature. Societies retained a balance between scientific advancement and economic stability, avoiding the extreme wartime acceleration that historically produced rapid but destructive breakthroughs. Industries focused on trade, urban growth, and consumer technologies, giving populations stability and prosperity without the urgent push toward global dominance. While some sectors lagged, humanity benefited from a less catastrophic environment for innovation, preserving human capital and cultural continuity for the 21st century. Politically, Europe and the wider world developed unique systems to manage stability without the lessons imposed by totalitarian regimes. Germany never experienced the deep, guilt-driven reforms of post-war reconstruction, but also avoided the rise of a totalitarian state. Democratic institutions evolved unevenly, challenged by local nationalist and socialist factions, but protected by the broader lesson of failed extremism. France, Britain, and other nations developed regional coalitions and trade agreements to ensure mutual security, while the Soviet Union retained control over Eastern European states, but faced less external pressure, moderating its expansionist tendencies. The United Nations, if formed, operated in a less urgent climate, focusing on arbitration rather than enforcement. Regional conflicts still occurred, including localized wars in Africa and Asia, but these were contained diplomatically or militarily, without escalating into global conflagrations. Governance was complex, cautious, and decentralized, with global power distributed among multiple states rather than dominated by ideological superpowers locked in existential struggle. Cultural and social life flourished in a society less burdened by war trauma. Cities preserved historic architecture. Artistic and intellectual communities thrived without ideological purges, and literature, film, and music evolved uninterrupted by censorship or fear. European education systems prioritized both science and humanities, producing generations of scholars, engineers, and artists able to innovate in a stable environment. Media coverage and public discourse reflected diverse perspectives, as governments lacked the propaganda machinery that shaped opinion through fear and nationalism. Populations benefited psychologically from the absence of totalitarian terror, though social tensions remained due to inequality, regional disputes, and ideological debates. International travel and exchange occurred earlier and more freely, fostering interconnectedness before the advent of digital communication, while political discourse remained a vital arena for debate and civic engagement. Humanity's collective memory, unscarred by industrialized atrocity, shaped a society more cautious but more hopeful in confronting future challenges. By the early 21st century, this rewritten modern world was profoundly different yet familiar. National borders diverged slightly, alliances formed more fluidly, and global conflicts occurred in smaller regional theaters, rather than engulfing the planet. Technology lagged in areas driven by wartime urgency, but thrived in other fields due to uninterrupted research. Humanity entered a digital, interconnected era, later than in our timeline, but equipped with a population less traumatized and more adaptable. Ethical considerations in science, politics, and global governance were influenced by fragmented histories, producing societies wary of power but capable of innovation. The absence of Hitler did not create utopia. Instability, ambition, and conflict persisted, just redistributed across multiple actors and regions. This timeline offered a modern world where progress was measured, culture thrived, and human potential unfolded without the catastrophic acceleration driven by total war, setting the stage for a future that remained uncertain, precarious, but full of possibility. The world that emerged from the absence of Hitler was not a utopia, but a planet reshaped by fragmented power, cautious diplomacy, and redistributed ambition. Nations survived without the catastrophic consequences of a unified fascist threat, yet human ambition, greed, and ideological extremism persisted. Regional conflicts, civil unrest, and political coups occurred regularly, though their scale was contained by the lack of a single unifying figure capable of mobilizing millions toward total war. Economic recovery progressed unevenly, technology advanced more cautiously, and societies learned to navigate uncertainty without the stark lessons imposed by global war. Populations experienced less trauma, preserved cultural and intellectual infrastructure, and retained more human capital for innovation. But the planet remained tense, aware that power vacuums could still ignite crises. This world demonstrated that removing one man could dramatically alter history, but it could not erase the structural pressures that drive humanity toward conflict and ambition. Geopolitically, regional powers balanced each other in a more diffuse, unstable configuration. Europe, freed from the shadow of Nazi Germany, relied on cautious alliances, trade agreements, and diplomatic negotiations to maintain order. The Soviet Union retained influence in Eastern Europe, but faced a less urgent counterbalance, allowing smaller nations to negotiate their own survival with skill and strategy. Asia experienced slower, more fragmented imperial expansion, with Japan still pursuing regional dominance, but lacking the global context to escalate conflicts further. Africa and the Middle East saw delayed decolonization and slower geopolitical shifts, as the absence of global total war reduced the urgency of political restructuring. Global institutions, if formed, operated with more deliberation and less immediate pressure, focusing on arbitration rather than enforcement. The modern world, while relatively stable, retained constant friction, a reminder that structural conflicts endure even without a singular historical villain. Culturally and socially, humanity benefited from fewer large-scale catastrophes, allowing traditions, arts, and knowledge to thrive uninterrupted. Intellectuals and scientists navigated less oppressive political systems, fostering innovation in medicine, engineering, and the sciences. Education systems expanded steadily, creating generations more capable of addressing complex societal challenges. Media and literature reflected diverse perspectives, untainted by propaganda machinery that historically manipulated fear and obedience. Societies retained memory of instability but without the mass trauma of totalitarian control, producing populations that were cautious but resilient. The psychological landscape of this world differed profoundly, emphasizing negotiation, adaptation, and incremental progress over revolutionary fervor and violent upheaval. This continuity in culture and education created fertile ground for scientific, technological, and social development that might have been stunted in our real timeline. Technology and innovation progressed unevenly, accelerated in some areas, while delayed in others due to the absence of global war pressures. Military advancements occurred more cautiously. Civilian technologies developed steadily, and space exploration progressed at a slower but collaborative pace. Nuclear research advanced cautiously, delaying both weaponization and energy application, while computing and communication technologies emerged later, but more deliberately. This careful development allowed societies to integrate progress with stability, avoiding the catastrophic consequences of rushed innovation. Transportation, medicine, and urban planning improved incrementally, producing a planet that was technologically capable but not pushed to extremes by the urgency of global conflict. Humanity's survival was ensured not by rapid leaps, but by measured, resilient adaptation, shaping a world where long-term progress was possible without the devastating acceleration imposed by global war. In the final analysis, a world without Hitler revealed a profound truth. History is shaped by both individuals and structural forces. Removing one man altered the timeline dramatically, preventing total war, genocide, and catastrophic societal collapse. Yet human ambition, greed, and conflict remained potent. Regional powers, ideological struggles, and economic pressures persisted, producing a planet defined by cautious diplomacy and incremental progress rather than explosive violence. Humanity retained its creative, scientific, and social potential, yet lived under a constant awareness that instability could erupt at any moment. This timeline invites reflection. Does removing a single historical villain truly improve humanity? Or does it merely redistribute danger and opportunity across multiple actors? Viewer question: would the world be better or simply dangerous in a different way? The answer lies not in history alone, but in the choices humanity makes when opportunity, ambition, and fear collide.